and Foreign Affairs Resilience at the Foreign Service Institute, Beth. We have Ambassador Prudence Bushnell, who has had a distinguished career, including Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, Ambassador. So good afternoon, and thank you for being here. I'm Barbara Stevenson, and I'm the president of AFSA, the American Foreign Service Association. As members of the Foreign Service, we have chosen important and meaningful careers, and I know that I, for one, wouldn't trade it for anything else. But with our chosen career path comes the stress of frequent moves, starting a new job every couple of years, uprooting our families, and very often doing all of this while navigating a new language and a new country, and sometimes even a new continent. Most other people in America don't live like this. Our work is often carried out in countries that are unstable or offer subpar medical care or have highway safety records that make a trip to the beach a real decision point, as in, do you think it's really worth the risk? So the careers we've chosen, our service as American diplomats and development workers, comes with great rewards. The thrill of representing our great country abroad, of making meaningful change, of working with exceptional colleagues in pursuit of an inspiring mission. But it also comes with built-in stressors that are just not found in most other career choices. Even on a good day, far from a war zone, our work can leave us feeling stretched thin and stressed. So we've organized this panel today to coincide with our March edition of the Foreign Service Journal, which is focused on health and wellness in the Foreign Service. And we're here to talk about resilience. So some of you may wonder, what is that rubber band on my seat about? So here we are. Please pull out your rubber bands, and I want to take a moment at the outset here to do a quick exercise, because I'm a big believer that a shared, powerful metaphor can create a deeper understanding and facilitate a better discussion. And this gem is brought to us by Jenny Orloff. Jenny, are you still here? There's Jenny in the back. Jenny is our Chief of Staff here at AFSA, and she happens to have, come on in guys, prior service as the Community Liaison Officer in Benin and a certificate in counseling for grief, loss, and life transitions. And she shared this with us as we were preparing. So pick up your rubber bands and stretch it between your fingers. So we might think of resilience as the ability to bounce back, right? Like a rubber band can bounce back. So like a rubber band, we have the ability to stretch, and at times we really have to do that. There's just no way around it. But there may be times when we're stretched so thin that we're at danger of snapping. What happens when that thing snaps? Ouch. Is that a good thing for the workforce? No, right? So that's it. We can get stretched so thin we're in danger of snapping. And in that state, even a small challenge, the copier jams at the wrong moment, the underline function screws up, and the next thing we know, it can be just, a snapping moment, and we can't really cope. So small things can take us beyond the breaking point, and let alone a major event. Now let's let it come back into a more comfortable state here, where we've got some flex in there. Practicing resilience is one of the ways to think about it. It's working to maintain a comfortable place, an optimal tension, so that when something stressful occurs, we have the flexibility to deal with it and bounce back. Each time you bring yourself back from there into this optimal place, you are practicing resilience, and you are, I think, making yourself a much more valuable asset to your team and to America's global leadership. So that's what the rubber band is about. Each of you have a copy of the Foreign Service Journal on your chairs too, and I encourage you to take the time to read it. Inside you're going to find a variety of interesting articles, including this gem on page 38 by Beth Payne, who's one of our panelists. It's a comprehensive look at enhancing resilience. My own column at the front of the magazine this month, and it's the first one that I have published since we just all collectively went through the longest shutdown in government history, which took a toll on all of us. That column of mine is a reflection on some of the gems of wisdom that Beth shared in her column. So to our panel, we're lucky to have with us a panel with considerable amount of professional insight, knowledge, and leadership on the topic of resilience. We have Beth Payne, the director of the Center of Excellence in Guatemala, ambassador to Kenya, and dean of the Leadership and Management School at the Foreign Service Institute, Bushnell, and Dr. Felicia Wilson-Young, the deputy director of programs for the Staff Care Center at the U.S. Agency for International Development. Dr. Young. So we'll start with a discussion about resilience and what it means for us in the Foreign Service, and then we'll open up for your questions, and we have a mic there in the center aisle. So without further ado, would you all please join me in welcoming our panel? So I'm going to start with you, Beth. We all have ideas about what resilience means, but your work full-time now is in resilience. And so I would like for you to spend a few minutes unpacking resilience for us and tell us what it means to us in the Foreign Service.
Thank you. Well, Barbara, you had mentioned in your introduction how, life in the Foreign Service carries a certain level of stress that a lot of professions don't necessarily carry. And I realized this after getting PTSD during my service in Iraq, struggled to recover, and then looked at resilience as, a research of thinking, how could I have acted differently? How could I have protected myself from getting PTSD? And realized that actually this ability to bounce back, the ability to thrive in adversity, the ability to be adaptable and flexible and collaborative under times of stress is important, not just to those of us going and serving in posts like Iraq and Afghanistan, but it's actually important for us throughout the entire Foreign Service career. And as I started to look at people's state of resilience, because it really is a state of being, we may be born more resilient or less resilient, but life happens, and today my resilience is going to be different than it is tomorrow. I was noticing that after 20 years in the Foreign Service, people's resilience had eroded. Maybe they started in the green, what I call high resilience. In orientation, they were adaptable and flexible and collaborative and energized. And they moved a few times. Maybe they were a consular officer who worked on a plane crash like our consular officers in Addis Ababa are doing. Or they wrote human rights reports that they had some secondary trauma from seeing and experiencing what people have been through. Or maybe they worked for a terrible boss who created a toxic work environment. I mean, there were lots of reasons why over time people's resilience was eroding to what I would call the yellow of resilience, where you started to get more irritable. Maybe your memory wasn't as good. Maybe you weren't sleeping as well. You were moody, maybe more likely to engage in risky behavior, maybe some misconduct showing up, where really we weren't at our best. We were more reactive than proactive. We weren't producing what we thought we could. But then your resilience can be so low. Like I went to Iraq probably in the yellow. I'd been to Rwanda after a genocide. I'd been through terrorist attacks in Israel. I had, served in Kuwait after the Gulf War. I probably went to Iraq in the yellow. So that when I was in a rocket attack that was life-threatening, I was vulnerable to having a mental health condition, and I was in the red. And so what we wanted to do as Foreign Service officers is to think about, how do we stay in the green all the time? How do we actively foster an environment for ourselves and for the people who work with us so that we're always in the green, so that no matter what happens to us, we're still able to perform as well as we possibly can, and we can help the people around us stay in the green, because it's not just about us as individuals. We have to ensure that our community, that the foreign affairs community stays highly resilient in the green, so we can manage these stressors, so that we can achieve our foreign policy goals despite the craziness of life in the Foreign Service. And so that's just a little bit of an introduction of why I think resilience is so important for this community.
Thank you, Beth. Thank you. So, Prue and Felicia, you have also both done or are currently involved in thinking about resilience. Prue, can you share a bit about the lens through which you view this topic? And then, Felicia, I'm going to ask you to do the same.
I was a Foreign Service child, so I know exactly if you speak of what you speak. And it took me about, I don't know, 50 years to forgive my father from going from Karachi, Pakistan to Tehran, Iran between my junior and senior year. And I guarantee you I made my parents' life miserable for many years as a result. So of course my mother was astounded when at mid-level I joined the Foreign Service through the Affirmative Action Program. I am now well out. I am in my third age. And I find resilience to be extraordinarily important to my well-being. And I am far more intentional about exercising, about having friends. And the woman in the very back is Beth Shearer. She and I became friends at the Karachi American School in 1960. And she's going to be selling my book, I have to say this, $20 after tax. And it is hanging out with people like that that becomes important as you move into your, I am more than 70, and I am married to a man who is going to be turning 85 years old. And resilience becomes important for both of us. As I have gone to peddle my book in different venues and in front of different audiences, I have really been taken back because remember, we've been weaned on, nobody understands the Foreign Service, we have no constituency. Not true. Go on out, start talking about life in the Foreign Service, and what I have found was a huge amount of empathy and respect for the stress that we undergo, and a huge amount of resonance for the importance of resilience and for the importance of leaders promoting resilience. And when I tell people that I took 24 hours after the bombing, when I was being torn into, I had to be in 6 different places at the same time, the advice from Don Lydell, who was a dean at the Foreign Service Institute, came into my brain, and that was take care of your people and the rest will take care of itself. So many people nod. Yes, they nod in Mississippi, they nod in Florida, I bet they'll nod in Kansas as well to that advice. So stress is ubiquitous, resilience becomes important, particularly as you get older, and there are times when I still have symptoms of post-traumatic stress. And that's when it becomes really important. And when I find myself in bed in a fetal position, I get myself out and I start walking. Or I call my friend Beth, and we have a glass of wine, which also helps. However, let me end with this. All right, I know, people are frowning. As ambassador, I was very aware that you set the tone, right? So I went into a country team meeting. By the way, I was the only woman at the senior country, in the senior country team. And I walked in going to model, good behavior, and I said to our highly traumatized team, I'm practicing Reiki. Do you know what Reiki is? It's sort of woo-woo, but it's putting on hands. I said, I am practicing Reiki. I'm very happy to give you the name of the person who does it. It's helping me. I walked out. 3 men followed me and said, peering down at me, Ambassador, we're so happy you're practicing Reiki. We're following the RAD practice. Have you heard of RAD? Repression, alcohol, and denial, and it's working very well, they said. So we do have RAD, but RAD is different from resilience. Felicia, please. Take over, save me.
Yes. Thank you, Ambassador. In regards to resilience, the first thing that comes to mind for me is sort of like this saying, which I'm sure you all have heard, the oak fought the wind and it broke. The willow bend and it survived. And so when I think about resilience, that's the first thing that comes to mind for me, the importance as a Foreign Service officer and also as civil servants who also serve in this capacity in international development is to have that ability to bend. The only thing that I would argue with that particular phrase is it's not just important to be able to survive. Our goal is to thrive. And true resilience is the ability to thrive under the circumstances, under the consequences, under the unexpected incidents that we face as Foreign Service officers every day, all the time, right? So even if you sign up for Afghanistan, which I did, it was my #1 choice, and I went, and I served, and I loved it. However, the complexities of dealing with gender-based violence day to day, the trauma that I experienced, the secondary trauma that I experienced by working with our beneficiaries has a level of impact. How do you unpack that experience and do it in a way when you're still able to be your best self, to be able to show up in a way and serve that community when you're looking at atrocities day to day? So when I think about resilience, it's really important for me to have that practice, the practice of meditation, the practice of reflection, the practice of just taking pause, the practice of kindness. Things that a lot of times people hear and they say, oh, look at that, USAID staff care, they're the ones who give out hugs. Mm-hmm. But it's so much more than that. It's not just about giving out the hug, it's also equipping people with the tools to be able to tap into their own personal resilience. And so when I think of resilience, that's what I think of. Let's not just be able to bend, but let's be able to thrive when we become upright again and give ourselves the kindness and the ability to take time out to heal. And in both of the situations that you all shared, you took that time out to heal. You gave yourself that permission to heal. And that's how I think about resilience.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Prue, I spoke in my introduction about how our chosen careers as members of the Foreign Service inherently calls on us to be resilient. But you faced a particularly, and I'm tempted to even use the word uniquely, horrific event. And 20 years ago, we just commemorated the East Africa bombings together last summer. You had to experience that, survive it, and then lead your team through it. What do you think was the most important thing you did during that critical time to foster resilience among affected members of the Embassy Nairobi community?
Three parts of it. The first part is when Richard Buckley, my husband, and I arrived in Nairobi, we had been made aware of the fact that Nairobi has bad morale, always has had bad morale, always will have bad morale. Well, excuse me, isn't that a delicious leadership challenge? We came in with an intentional agenda to, on the embassy side, off-site, find out what it was that we could do as a country team that would make it meaningful for us, because back in Washington when I left, everybody around town said nothing good can happen as long as Daniel Arap Moi is president. Goodbye, good luck, don't write us, we won't write you. Yes! That's a wonderful leadership opportunity, because if nobody cares unless the country declares war on you, you can do wonderful things. And we picked out corruption, we picked out women's education and HIV/AIDS, and we picked out helping the Kenyans to flatten the political field before the elections. We did it, we used interagency teamwork to implement it. We included our Kenyan colleagues, so we had meaningful goals and we had trust. I also told people at the very beginning, don't be afraid to give me feedback. And the first time somebody did, I thought, who gave you permission? Oh, right, I did. All right, what I learned was, particularly after the bombing, people were not afraid to give me feedback, and thank heavens they did, because I wasn't brilliant enough to keep this, our truly traumatized community who are taking care of orphans and widowers and people who had picked up the body parts of their colleagues. Unless they told me what needed to happen, I would not have been able to make the right decisions. And the third part of it was that we intentionally put people first. I took taking care of my people, especially after 2 years of warning the department of the vulnerabilities and being told by the department to stop nagging, end quote, and then being blown up. I was jolly well going to take care of my people, and you know what? The rest took care of itself. And Felicia, to get back to your remark, one of my mantra sentences every day was be kind to yourself and be kind to one another. And years later, a junior officer who had never been in another post said, wow, I didn't realize that people said that to each other in the Foreign Service. And lastly, we had colleagues come in from all over the world. Foreign Service national colleagues, civil service colleagues, Foreign Service colleagues. They gave us new energy and they gave us perspective, which when you are in crisis is really important.
Thank you, Prue. Felicia, we often talk about building resilience at the beginning, about building it on an individual level, but when we were discussing, having our conversation before the panel, you introduced a wonderful idea about resilience at the organizational level. And you talked about building an ethical practice of care.
Yes.
I was enchanted by the concept. Can you talk about it a little bit?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, so I have been sort of unpacking the idea of the ethic of care, which is from Carol Gilligan, right? So my background is in education, and definitely in education you need that element of resilience. But when you look at the ethic of care, it's about building relationships and not just caring about yourself and the outcomes, but also caring about the people that you work with. Again, it gets deeper to having that ethic of care for the possibility of knowing the people you work with, knowing what matters to them, knowing their response and their ability to sort of be an addition to the group at large, and particularly in relationship to interdependence. So if we talk about the ethic of care and we talk about it from an organizational perspective of what's needed, we would look at how important it is for the organization to have a mutual responsibility to the individual. I believe often as a Foreign Service officer, we come in and we know that we're a part of this whole, right? We're a part of the 3Ds. We're a part of making a difference, and we sign up for various reasons. But if you look at it and begin to unpack it from explore the idea of the ethic of care from an organizational perspective, based on Carol Gilligan's way about building interdependence and not just being self-reliant, but recognizing that the work that we do is impacted by our ability to function and perform as a whole, to reach the goals, and that the organization also has a responsibility to us as individuals and as a collective to be able to respond, to be supportive. And what makes me think about it, for instance, in times when Foreign Service officers, have a cancellation of assignments, how that deeply affects their families, how that deeply affects their lives. They're uprooted, they're changed, they signed up for something, and now things are shifting. Where is it that the organization takes the opportunity to reflect and think about the level of impact that is going to create for that Foreign Service officer, for their family, and beyond, both emotionally, physically, and is it possible we can shift that conversation to develop an ontology of possibilities of saying, as an organization, we have a responsibility to you, as a team, we have a responsibility to each other, and then be able to scaffold that opportunity for collaboration. And so when you look at the ethic of care, that's where I'm coming from. I think it's a new discussion that we can begin to unfold and unpack in regards to organizational development.
Still enchanted with that concept. I have to tell you, even more so after that. Thank you. Beth, you write in your article about the concept not just of individual resilience, but of teams that are characterized by high resilience. Can you talk about that a little bit, and why does it matter that you have teams with high resilience?
So happy to. I've always read in the research that a group of highly resilient people does not automatically become a resilient team. And I saw this firsthand at a consulate that had experienced a traumatic event. When I assessed the resilience of the individuals, they bounced back really quickly from that event. They performed well individually, after the event. But as a team, they fell apart. As a team, they did not collaborate well. There were a lot of silos. They did not communicate well. And that was for the first time when I saw really firsthand that the team itself was not achieving its foreign policy goals. There were some missteps that they regretted, and these were highly capable people. These were good leaders and managers and staff, but they did not perform as well as they wanted to perform. And so that was when it really became so clear to me that while we need to focus on our individual resilience, and the article gives you some tips and tools on how to do that, even more so as leaders and as members of teams, we need to focus on the resilience of the group. And I'm really talking about communities, not necessarily as an organization. So I'm not talking about budgets and risk management. I'm talking about how does a group of people become one team through shared missions, through shared goals, by communicating regularly, by taking care of people, putting people first, by being kind and grateful and appreciative of each other, by being synchronized across the group and coordinated so that everybody is really working in the same direction. When those groups of people are resilient, really we can do amazing things. And I saw this myself when I ran the Office of Children's Issues. I directed the Office of Children's Issues for 3 years. This is an office that dealt with child kidnapping and child adoption, two of the most traumatic and difficult topics a consular officer can work on. And at the time, there was a lot of turnover. People were not happy in their jobs. There's an enormous amount of secondary stress that individuals were experiencing. People were literally crying in the hallway. And we were not productive. We were not doing the work we needed to do. And we were getting yelled at by Congress, by the news media, by the senior leaders in the State Department. It was not pleasant. And so I focused on building the resilience of this team. I didn't focus on all the management, strategic planning, and goals and all this other stuff that's helpful, but I realized the resilience of this team was so low. In 3 years, by focusing on the resilience of the team, we became proactive instead of reactive. We could solve problems that were insurmountable before. When Russia cut off adoptions, and normally the State Department gets blamed, we were so good at collaborating with other agencies like the Department of Homeland Security, and we were so proactive with adoptive parents that the State Department was never blamed for that. That, to me, is a foreign policy achievement. We persuaded the Japanese government to join a convention on child abduction, something that was impossible before because we would collaborate across the State Department. We worked more closely with our embassies. We were much more strategic. And so that showed me that the foreign policy goals that appeared to be impossible just 3 years previously were not only achievable, but we could do even more than that. We convinced Congress to pass a law on adoption. Imagine at a time when Congress wasn't passing anything. We collaborated with a former enemy in the Department of Homeland Security who became a friend because our resilience was higher and we were more collaborative and kind to achieve really, truly what was out. We did not believe this could ever be done. So I would propose that don't just focus on your own individual resilience, but really learn how to foster the resilience of the teams, and that team will perform in ways that you can only imagine.
Let me get a show of hands of how many people would rather I just ask right now for Beth to spend a minute on how do you make a more resilient team. So let's just go for that, Beth.
Right, so we formulated what we call the 7 C's of team resilience, which is basically you want to have one community. You want to have one group that works towards shared values, shared goals, shared history, a shared culture. And so you want to do that by talking to each other about your histories, about your stories. Who are you? Why are you here? Another C is communication. People need to feel well informed about what's going on. And it's recognizing that communication is not just an email, but there are multiple forms of communication we can use. The best form of communication is a question. The most powerful method of communicating is to ask questions. Have dialogues. Don't just report out. Don't just send an email when you can pick up the phone and talk to somebody, or better yet, walk down the hall and talk to somebody. Also, coordination. We want to be in sync. Are we working towards the same mission, the same goals? Are we in sync from top to bottom? Are we doing what our secretary wants us to do and what the White House wants us to do and what the American people want us to do? So staying in sync is really crucial. Consideration is the taking care of people. This is my favorite of the 7 C's. This is just be appreciative of each other. Get to know each other as human beings. Be kind. And I did this in one group where basically all the suggestions people gave to improving resilience was just be kind to me. We had this big, list of just be kind. You also have connections. People need to know each other. Groups of people need to know each other, not just as titles. In the State Department, we always use letters to describe people instead of their names. We don't know anything behind the letter. We say M. What does that mean? No, who's the person filling that position? And getting to know people as individuals. How many C's have I done? 5 C's?
That's 5.
That's
So
5. 2 more.
Now you're going to challenge me and see, can I do these off the top of my head? Let's see, communication, connections, consideration, community, competence. We need to be well trained. We need to have the capacity and the abilities to do our jobs. We need to not cut that training budget the minute we get a budget crisis. And what's my 7th C? I know. So here's what you do. You go to the State Department blog.
It'll come.
Yeah,
In the
it'll
middle of the
come.
night,
It'll
you'll
come
wake
to
up.
me.
That was so helpful.
Also, in my next blog for my website that's on the internet, payneresilience.com, I will be listing the 7 C's of team resilience or of community resilience. So go there for the 7th C.
How's that for storytelling? Y'all want to know the 7th C? You'll be regular followers of the blog. That was great. Prue, you are a leadership icon, and you were the dean of the leadership school at FSI, and you molded and shaped generations of us in the Foreign Service, including me. I'll never forget being in the senior executive threshold seminar class and being discouraged, and many of us were, and you led us through one of the most powerful discussions of what do you do when you really disagree with the policy direction, from doing nothing to quitting, which you reminded us. How many times do you get to resign in protest? Once. So we worked on things that were in the middle, that were a little bit better than doing nothing and weren't quite so final as just walking away. So it was powerful. I'm not sure that everybody's had a chance to be in one of your classes. So could you just share some of the wisdom that you've offered over the years about digging deep and practicing resilience?
The reason that we put so much emphasis on doing is because that's what leading is. Thinking is not leading. Writing papers is not leading. Doing is leading. I think that resilience, as Felicia points out, is not only a personal responsibility, it's a leader's responsibility. It is a leadership responsibility. Leaders ultimately are judged by 2 criteria, according to Barbara Kellerman, and I agree. Those criteria are competence and ethics. And resilience comes into both. We are a community that has seen the good, bad, and the ugly since 1789. We are living through a period of leadership that is showing a total disinterest in both competence and ethics. When I read the government Government Accountability Office report on the number of staffings. I read 27 of the past 27 inspectors' reports, of which 17 note the impact of bad leadership, bad morale, and staffing gaps, 17 out of 27. I read about the Congress requesting that State Department come on over to the Hill, send documents to the Hill about political retaliation of civil servants, and we need to, leadership, lesson number one is accept the reality. This is what we are living in. We have gone through this before. Let me remind you of Allison Palmer's class action in the 1970s, the Young Turks that helped form AFSA as a union in the 1970s. I got an email the day before yesterday from Ambassador Jane Kuhn, who was one of my best bosses, who said, I hear you're going to do something on resilience. Would you please remind people of what happened in 1979 when the community in Kabul had to pick up after their Ambassador Dobbs was assassinated? Iran, 54 hostages taken by the government of Iran. Pakistan, Pakistani and American employees in the vault, literally almost burning to death, while the government of Pakistan waited their own sweet time before coming, and then the President of the United States says, what a great guy the President is, and by the way, everybody in the embassy, you'd better make nice to them. We are part of a profession that has provided the defense for our communities, our people, and our government without any guns for centuries, and we sometimes get bad bosses. So what do we do when we get bad bosses? All right, number one, look at the tools you have. You have 3FAM 214 that gives leadership principles, including resilience. You have an IG, an Inspector General, that is looking at those principles as he, she, they make their reports. We have a dissent mechanism. You have AFSA. You have your families, and we have a whole network of American citizens who are elderly American citizens who are going to the World Affairs Councils throughout the United States. You have a network of support. You need to ask. Ain't gonna happen unless you ask. I can tell you, as the woman who went back to the Department of State time after time to say this is a vulnerable building, and I was told, so sorry, we have no money, so therefore we are going to waive our own security requirements. Unethical, incompetent, people died. We got through it anyway. We will continue to, and we will do it together. Last thing, remember why you joined. Everybody who's listening, remember why you joined. And if you ever need reminders of the impact, look at how much, for all the trouble we are going through, we do have a better world. And it's thanks to all of you who are listening. You deserve the resilience. Use it yourself and begin to look deeply into the eyes of the leadership and say, hey folks, see me? You need to show competence and ethics with regard to the work we are doing.
Wow. Felicia? Yes, this is, I just think it's amazing how this is all being woven together, because there are two statements I want to make. One is a statement in regards to what Beth was saying about appreciation. And when I think about resilience, it's not just appreciation, but also there's action, right? It's the action that an organization or that teams or that individuals or that communities need to be cognizant of, that you can take action, but you can also, I don't know, create an opportunity to be personally responsible for fostering that community, and that there has to be action behind it, particularly starting with the leadership that's been mentioned earlier, looking at the people. But then there's also that other element of action in regards to physical space, which Ambassador Prue just totally pinpointed, the importance of how the setting of the environment that you're in affects you and affects your own resilience as a community and also as an individual. The importance of that leadership. Where are they? What is their ethical barometer? And how that they're implementing the ability for us to reach the goals and the objectives. And that's really what jumped out to me just now, was that sense of not only should you have ethics of conduct, ethics of behavior, ethics of reflection, there are just so many connections to ethical actions that has to kind of be in place, and for an organization and the individuals or teams to sort of map that out, to create, again, as I said before, this ontology of possibilities. It's all possible. The things that Beth and her team were able to accomplish, it's possible. The way that we are, as Foreign Service officers, we bounce back, we dig in, we process, and we're able to create the deliverables. And then we're honored for that. You've created the deliverable, you met the thing. But the piece about how do you begin to sort of break up these erroneous frameworks that have you completely exhausted, that have you with low morale, that continue to impact you psychologically and physically. And so the connection that I would make, again, gets back to an ethical practice and a practice of care. When you care about the team that you're working with, you're going to address certain issues. You're going to be able to map out the actions that are necessary to create a healthy workforce, a healthy environment. And that's the first thing that came to my mind as I was listening to what was just shared, is just the importance of that, and how we can't just, in order for us to eradicate the things that we're dealing with that keep us, overwhelmed, oppressed, and questioning, what are we doing? What are we really doing here? It, again, gets back to that ability to not just care, but put an action behind it. Ask questions, show up as your best self. Just show up as your best self.
And I kind of want to come back to that, which is showing up as our best self. We've had a really rich conversation here about the mission and whether you pull the team together and they achieve the mission, and what a difference that makes, and what it looks like when we don't, and what it looks like when we do. Sometimes what we feel like we really can control is showing up as our best self. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I wanted to close out this part by coming back to you, Beth. Yeah. Talk about that. How do we show up, each of us, as our best self, our resilient best selves?
So I have to say, practicing resilience is not easy. Mm-mm. This is not an easy fix. I can tell you to eat well, but why aren't you eating well? I can tell you to put people first. Why aren't you putting people first? What we need to do is very intentionally ask ourselves, what are the barriers to me showing up as our best self? Be very clear about what those barriers are. Is the pressure from your boss to meet a deadline preventing you from communicating effectively with your team? Okay, address that barrier. How do you minimize or eliminate the barrier? But I would argue that a lot of us, we focus on what I'm going to do better as a result. What am I going to do differently as a result? And we forget to think about what's stopping me from doing that. And then clearly identifying it and having a good strategy for how to minimize or eliminate the barriers. The other thing that's hard, we are in a culture right now that does not necessarily encourage resilience. Let's just be real. I'm about culture change. I started this effort over 10 years ago to change the culture of the State Department. But the culture of the State Department still It's better than it was 10 years ago, but it still is sort of suck it up, get the job done, and if you suffer, well, it's an up or out process anyway, so you're soon going to be out. Well, we need to realize that we're fighting against that culture. That when I teach you how to say no in a culture that never says no, you have to have the courage to take the risks associated with still saying no. You have to take the risks associated for going against the grain, for going against the culture, because it's the only way the culture changes. If you aren't willing to take the risks, and you aren't willing to sometimes pay a price, you know, risk implies sometimes you're not going to get the benefits. You're going to pay a price. If you're not willing to pay the price, then you will find yourself not showing up as your best self. You're going to make compromises. You're going to look back and regret and say, wow, I wish I had done things differently. So just know that you do have the courage, you have the ability. If we all commit just today, oh, commitment, that's the 7th C.
Yeah.
I knew you'd do it.
The 7th C is you commit to your
Right,
community.
right.
If we all commit today to saying, you know what, I'm going to take the risk. I'm going to sometimes pay a price to bring about a change of culture and to foster a resilient culture within the foreign affairs community. When I look back in another 10 years, I'm going to know that we've achieved what I set out to achieve 10 years ago.
I do sometimes say irreverently, and I'll probably regret that this is on the tape, but remember, they can't fire us all. So here we are. And with that irreverent comment, I just ask you to commit to the culture change. Here's the thing, when we say no, it can seem like we're abandoning the mission and we don't think it's important, which is why I think it was so important for Beth to walk us through getting Congress on our side, getting the treaty through, fundamentally changing the outcomes for the better and shifting the framework so that you didn't just day after day take the bludgeoning that comes from failing, but you actually, I often talk about, you know, the example of Africa. Stop trying to lay landlines, just go to the cell phone towers.
Right.
You know, is there a way to reframe this where we can step back and all go and make the leap? And we can produce better outcomes with this. It's not a choice of leaving the mission undone. It's about thinking about a different way to do it. And there's a real challenge in there, and it does entail risk. You're so right about that. That was a wonderful panel. A round of applause for our panelists. Thank you. We now have a mic that Christine Mealy is holding. Who would like to ask the first question for our panelists? And please identify yourself if you don't mind. And Alan, are we running the Q&A session or not?
So I can tape it and then cut it, or not tape it at all?
So if anybody objects to having your question run, just let Alan know on the way out, and we'll edit it out.
Happily clear.
How about that? Good? Okay.
We might want to edit this. Here's the thing. You were talking about this culture of suck it up. And I have noticed that people who I call the walking wounded are walking the hallways of the State Department every day because they're afraid to ask for help.
Yes.
And a lot of times they will go to a high threat post, and then they will go to somewhere like Paris or Italy, and they'll put a suit on, but that doesn't address the problems that they might have. And I know that MED has a really great program for PTSD, and MED is probably helping to support up these programs on resilience. But the culture that you were just talking about still prevents people from coming forward to admit, yes, I need help, because they're afraid they won't get a security clearance. How can we fight that?
Who would like to take that?
You want to start?
Sure, I can start. I think you have a very valid point, and as a Foreign Service officer, I've talked to many colleagues who say, oh, there's no way I'm going to even use staff care services. I'm not going to use your employee assistance program, which is our counseling program, because I don't want this to prevent me from getting my security clearance. And so what we tried to do is really, we literally went to lengths to get a statement from SEC that says this does not in any way impact your security clearance. And whenever we tell people about our particular program, we share that information so that they're aware that this really is a completely confidential process. Not your supervisor, not SEC, no one is aware that you have received any sort of counseling support for you or for your family. So that's been one way, at least at USAID, we've been able to handle it. The other piece that you spoke about was the walking wounded, and how those individuals first have to be able to recognize, or someone around them. That's what the community piece is about. I think that Beth mentioned, is being able to have a community where others can help us sometimes reflect and see exactly where are we with ourselves, to do that reflection process, to check ourselves. Because often, you're right, many people go from every critical priority country, from Afghanistan to Sudan, from Sudan to, wherever. Most don't end up in Paris, right? And so how do we then begin to help them do some self-reflection to say, you need some support, we can help you. It may not look like EAP counseling, but it may look from an organizational perspective of talking about making some plans of where your next post will be, or talk about with your family, how has this impacted your relationship with your spouse and your children, et cetera, and creating that safe environment for that. And I think it's one person at a time. Having the opportunity to say you will not be penalized, that's one thing. But we always say, oh, there are no secrets in our organizations, right? There's always that hallway perception as well. And I think that building the community, strong communities where people can then sort of give testimonials about how their own lives have been changed because they became more resilient through using these program resources. So,
And I would argue that we need to break the stigma of seeking mental health care by being open and honest about having sought mental health care. I mean, I sought mental health care. It was the smartest thing I ever did. I still got a security clearance. I still got a Class A med clearance. My career improved. I actually became a more successful foreign service professional as a result of the mental health care. And I say that so openly because it shouldn't be a secret. If I want to keep it secret, I respect that people will keep that confidentiality. But when we have a secret, we imply there's a reason, there's something wrong. When I want to keep it secret, I'm implying that it's not the right thing to do. So I am open and honest. I beg everybody who has sought mental health care to be very honest about it with their colleagues and say, yeah, I got mental health care, look at me. Because it's the fear that this is going to have a negative impact that is often stopping people from seeking the care that they need. And honestly, I had PTSD. I was not going to get better without mental health care. There was waiting it out like I did for 2 years. Even some of the resilience practices I teach would not have helped me. Resilience does not cure mental health conditions. Resilience helps you thrive in adversity. A mental health professional helps you recover from a mental health condition. And you've got to be open and able to seek that care that you need. And so really, I encourage everybody, speak openly if you have sought mental health care and talk about the benefits it's given you.
Especially in our environment, because if it is perfectly normal if people are being sent to very stressful posts that they would react. I mean, the normal thing is you react, right? Yeah. So there's nothing wrong with being a human being. We can take malaria prophylaxis and still get malaria.
Right.
Maybe we should start using that as a code. Sent to malarial post, got malaria.
Hi, my name is Laura Banks, and I want to just speak to what you were saying about, so my husband has served in Afghanistan twice. I'm an EFM. And our second tour, we went to Geneva, which is about the most lovely place you could choose to live, right? And it really was, except that my husband came home from Afghanistan. We sent our son on a mission for our church. I packed us out while he was doing training for his next tour. We landed with 2 teenagers who were really upset about having gotten torn out of their lives in Geneva, and he started working 60 hours a week because he was filling in for a position which had been empty for 3 months. So that, when you land in a cushy tour, it is not cushy, especially because Geneva, there is no community. There were 5 schools that kids went to. We didn't live in an environment, our kids weren't neighbors. They were some of the only Americans in their schools. So I think part of building resilience, because we got through that because of our resilience, but part of what needs to also change is this idea that somehow sending people to easy posts is a gift. Because often those easy posts come with incredible challenges that don't have the supports in place that a different post may have. And also, you know, so I worked in the CLO office there. I think everybody I knew who was coming out of a high critical post curtailed, went back to a critical post, or had medical issues that caused them and their family to go home. I think seriously, every single one. And I'm just wondering, has the data been tracked, right? Has anybody looking at how landing in an easy post actually does not support an individual or a family?
I'm going to do something odd here and call on Sid to talk about your
The
study.
data.
Do you mind?
Talk about what?
Well,
study.
you want to reply to that? I think you maybe have done the best study of this.
Hi, I'm Siddhartha Ashwin Shah. I'm Greenleaf Integrative Strategies. Stand, okay.
You can come up here if you want. And then
And your husband knows me as Sid because I tell people when you're out of breath, you can use just 3 letters. My
Okay.
full name is Siddhartha. First, I just want to say yes, 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 because it's just it's mind-blowing how far this field has gotten. One of the ways that I'm in your tribe is by being in a different training kind of pool. I'm a physician, and I went through medical school where we talked a lot about wounded healers, actually even being wounded before you got to being a physician, because the process wounded you. And then the experience of the collision of working in a space where one's values took you there, and the question was, why did you choose this line of work, right? But then the reality does not line up with that idealism and your actual competence to be able to do what you're trained to do. And so that gap, we were talking earlier about moral injury, which I have a question about. But when it comes to, I think tracking, what I'm aware of is that USAID asked me and others to look at what was often seen as the first wartime suicide, Michael Dempsey. And Michael Dempsey, and I have his family's permission to talk about this, Michael was a tremendous young Foreign Service officer, having worked in critical priority countries. And he took his life through a whole matrix of problems and suffering. And at that time, Administrator Rajiv Shah asked Larry Sampler of the Office of Afghanistan and Pakistan Affairs, do we know how many more Michaels there are out there? Do we track this? Do we track the curtailments and the actual behaviors and the so-called rest posts? And the information and the data was extremely hard to actually parse out, some for privacy reasons. But actually, I think we're farther than ever. I invite you, Felicia, you'll know from the inside what USAID is trying to do with either big data and tracking. The Global Lab has been interested, but I think it's all just kind of notions, the ontology of possibility.
Yeah.
Yes. So I'll defer to you, but I think it's critical to be aware that all the intuitive aspects of what we think will help people recover are actually very paradoxical many times. And getting people's actual experiences, asking questions, the most powerful intervention. So
Thanks.
thank you.
That was perfect.
Felicia, I'm
Yeah.
going to turn to you. Beth, I want you to talk about, do we see much more resilience problems coming out of
That's what I was gonna say.
AIP, or is it more broadly distributed? Either one of you can take that.
That was what I was going to add to. Thank you, Siddhartha. I do appreciate it. I really believe that we've seen recently when staff care was sort of looking at exactly this issue. It's not just where you're coming from, right? Going from Afghanistan to Paris, but it's more so the long-term effect of a career of injury. I loved what you just said, right? Of a career of those injuries that people are experiencing psychologically, emotionally, and also sometimes physically, that has really impacted their ability to be resilient or not be resilient or to ask for help when they need that support. Recently, we've been looking at data to see, okay, we have someone, like you said, they've been to Afghanistan, they've been to Sudan, then they end up in Germany. That seems great for USAID. It's like, Frankfurt, what? I won the prize. But the reality is they get there and they're stressed, they're overwhelmed, their morale is already low, they're very broken, they've had fractured issues with their family. Your family was strong, but that's not most families. The reality is sometimes those children don't make it out. Those children don't adjust well from the separation from parenting or from having their lives uprooted. And so what we've seen is actually it's the long-term effect of life in the Foreign Service that has had more impact as opposed to their service in a critical priority post, as opposed to their CPC. Because the CPC, you can address your experiences there by incident, but it's the bad bosses, it's the separation from family, it's the systemic isms that we have even yet to begin to unpack. The issues of favoritism and racism and the lack of diversity and all of these isms are also a major part of why people are sort of stuck. I mean, we're all aware that within the brain, right, we have the capacity to sort of flight or fight, to be able to survive. And a lot of times I think the way the Foreign Service has been impacted and our community has been impacted, that often, a lot of people are kind of stuck. They're stuck on that first tour because they came in with some idealism and the system broke them down, sucked that out of them, told them that, yeah, your feelings are great. However, I really need you to accomplish this goal. And we don't have anything infrastructure-wise to begin to unpack that and to begin to say it's okay to come in and deal with your fragility. Because we do focus on, all right, suck it up, let's deliver the goals and the outcomes. So recently, USAID has been beginning to look at that. We don't have a systemic way of doing it. There's been a sort of collection of data here from staff care, some from security, some from HR, and it hasn't amounted to a full commitment. And that's what we need. We need a commitment to say that we are committed to the welfare and the well-being of our colleagues, of our workforce.
And I just wanted to add the challenge of coming out of what we view as traditionally high threat, high stress posts. So we run the high stress assignment outbrief, which is mandatory if you're coming out of certain high threat posts. But what we find is that the impact of service in a high threat or high stress post is very individual. Some are going to come out of it and say, this is the best tour I've ever had. I had a great leader. We had a great community. I'm highly resilient. Yay. And others are going to come out and be struggling. Maybe their lives were threatened, or maybe they were dealing with some incredibly difficult issues while they were at the post. And so tracking what happens to people is almost impossible, because one person can go to Italy right after and thrive. Another is going to go to France right after, and France is going to be the worst post they could have ever chosen to support them. I think what's most important is recognizing that this is an individual response, that a post that you thought was going to be the best post ever turns out to be your worst post because you have a toxic boss or a toxic employee. And I would say that in my anecdotal experience of doing this now, the single biggest cause of low resilience in the foreign affairs community is toxic leadership. Not a dangerous work environment. So listen to that. So we offer the high stress assignment outbrief to everybody. You can come out and say, I just worked for a toxic boss. That was high stress. That's why we call it a high stress assignment, not a high threat assignment.
Yes.
So just know as individuals, you need to choose what works for you. I luckily had the ability to choose Senegal, even though Maura Hardy told me that was a bad choice. I wish you would have chosen Europe. I said, no, there's lots of light. I have a good boss. It's not a very stressful post. I can kayak every day. That was good for me mentally. So allow yourselves to choose the best onward for you. There's no right answer.
Very good. Yeah.
So I'm very familiar with this issue. We've been following it for quite some time at the Transition Center at FSI. What I would argue is, so I'm working a lot on resilience for social change. There is a tool that we call the sphere of control that is a resilience tool, and it's really recognizing what do I control, what do I influence, and what do I just have to accept because I can have no impact. Resilience for social change is about the influence piece. It's saying I'm not going to accept racism. I'm not going to accept gender discrimination. I'm not going to accept that this institution is not caring about my children. I'm going to influence the institution so that it will change. The challenge is, as individuals, you need to take care of your own resilience so you don't burn out. Martin Luther King's my favorite model for this. He really did practice all 5 factors of resilience, which made him an incredibly effective social change agent. So practice the individual resilience. And then look at your team. You know, we built a team secretly 10 years ago, by the way, about resilience. Like we were like, you're part of the resilience team. Prue was an early, member of the team. And we met regularly and we talked about what we were going to do and how we were going to bring about social change. What were our tactics to achieve the final goal? So as a group, practice those 7 C's of team resilience. You are now a team trying to achieve social change within the State Department. It's long, it takes time, it's hard. It is well worth it. You will know that you're going to have small successes, you're going to have some, you're going to have some losses. But in the end, your effort to bring about social change within the State Department will succeed. It will absolutely succeed. We will not function as a foreign affairs community if we don't allow people to be part of our community if they have children with special needs. That is just wrong. We won't be effective. We won't achieve our foreign policy goals. So kudos to you. Keep it up. Stay in touch. Because one of my efforts, I'm leaving the State Department at the end of this month. I feel like I've created what I wanted to create. Now I need to do more. And one of my focuses will be on resilience for social change.
Yeah. Wow. Lily Waltuko has a question.
I do. Thank you so much for everyone. This has been incredible. For those of us that do the action that Felicia, you talk about, putting this kind of your practices personally into organizational change and taking action and doing the things Beth talks about as well and Prue that you embodied. Those of us who are on organizations, employee organizations and affinity groups do a lot of this work with AFSA in tandem with them. And we've accomplished a lot. What we struggle with, and I hope all of you will have some ideas on this, is how do you influence those who might not understand this isn't a nice to have, whatever the reform is, whether it be SNEA and med issues, work-life balance. The group I helped create was Balancing Act at State with a number of incredible civil and foreign service officers. And what we struggle the most is how do you influence those who think of it as a nice to have, and we have to always make the business case, which we've learned, but if you could give us some advice on how to continue making the business case for why this is important, not for just us as people, but for the organization, that would be really helpful. Thank you.
Great question. If you want to address that, Prue.
Okay, how do you make the business case? It begins with negotiating with the political tourists who come in. We love our tourists, yes, we love them and it can be a respectful negotiation. One of the things that I said when George Moose asked me to become Deputy Assistant Secretary was, oh, and by the way, one of the reasons I joined the Foreign Service was to feminize it because I was raised as a child who never saw her father. He worked all the time. He worked on Saturdays, then he'd come home, he'd deliver our orders, right? And Mom would say, well, at least it's not Ouagadougou. I went to Ouagadougou, found out why we were always saying what it's and then, boom, she would do the rest. I decided, because I was born to prod, my name is Prudence, I decided that I would go as far as possible in my career without working overtime. Okay, Position number 1, Senegal. Well, Prue, you got away with it this time, but you know, as you move up the ladder, I was General Services Officer 03. Boom. Next time I was admin officer in Bombay. I worked for myself. That was okay. Each time I kept getting told that I would not be able to leave after a certain number of hours at work because we didn't do that. I knew that unless I got sleep and I left, I would be not. And I told George, I will be here at 7 o'clock in the morning. I'm leaving every night at 6:30. If you have a problem with that, then you need to get somebody else. So number 1, don't work overtime.
7 to 6.
Number 2,
I know.
you don't. I know it is easier. I know everybody says we can't do that. I am here to tell you that you can do that, and if you don't do that, the culture will not change. The night of the bombing, we were blown up at 10:30 in the morning. At 10 o'clock at night, we had a perfectly capable group of people that were going to take over, and I said, I'm going home, and I want everybody who was in that building that was blown up to go home also. I'm going to home to weep, and I hope you do too. And I said that quite intentionally because I wanted to give people permission to be themselves. It is inexcusable. And the only reason people keep putting these stresses on us is because we keep accommodating them. Walk out the door. Hey, boss, you need this done. You need to get somebody. The Daz and I, the Daz, we decided, why are we both showing up on Saturday? How dumb is that? Okay, so you show up this Saturday, I'll show up the next. I had an assistant secretary tell me once, Prue, you can't leave at 6 o'clock anymore because the undersecretary gives meetings at 7 o'clock. And I said, then have him start the meeting at 5 o'clock or at 4 o'clock. I'm not going to be there. They could not, nor did my good bosses, expect that being physically present translated into meaningful output. Doesn't work that way. So, you know, if there are not enough people in your embassy or in your field, say, sorry, there's not enough people, 5 o'clock, I'm going home. Well, I'm going to write you up. Fine, write me up, I'll write you up. How dare you? Seriously, no, seriously, this is 2019. We are not back in the Industrial Revolution anymore. We are also in a democracy, and we have work rules. Thank you very much.
But also, when it comes to social change, it's really important that you identify who has the power to make that change.
That's true. Yes.
And then how do you influence the people who have the power? We spend too much time trying to influence people with no power. And then you have to understand, okay, if this is the person who can actually make the new policy, this is a person who can change the practice, this is a person who can actually, I need to influence, you have to understand the person's motivations. So for example, when I teach resilience to ambassadors, I scare them with failure because they're afraid of shame. They're afraid of failure and being called in front of Congress and having a hearing. So I tell them, if you don't practice resilience and you don't foster resilience, you're going to fail horribly and everyone's going to talk about you behind your back. With somebody else, I might use a different tactic. You know, I'm going to maybe say, no, here's how you better achieve your foreign policy goals. You have to know who you're trying to influence and use what affects that person. If it was Heather Higginbottom, it was, I want to be known as a woman who promoted well-being. You know, but be very intentional about who you need to influence and what that person needs and wants and how you can give it to them.
And I would add, lastly, in reference of, you've heard of sort of the marketing ideas like disrupt or be disrupted, right? The opportunity that in order to create change, there has to be a disruption. A disruption doesn't necessarily have to be a negative impact, but it's something that says, stop. This isn't working. So even in regards to the SNEA, as well as in regards to the use of the power of the ERGs, I would say be strategic and target those, as Beth said, who have the ability to make decisions and make change, and sort of think of it as a scaffolding, a way to build relationships. We are very relational in our organizations. We're very relational. We want to talk about the bureaucratic ways of being, but the reality is there are people who implement these policies and these ways of being. It didn't just drop out of the sky. And so use your power in that sense, your access and your action to connect with those people who are the decision makers. And you'd be surprised at who some of them are, right? It's not always the person with the title.
Yeah, that's true.
So, yeah.
May I just add one thing to that? If you walk in with a problem, walk in with a solution. Oh, Ambassador, you've got a problem. Oh, that's what I live for. Thank you. Yeah, now what? So getting back to what you say, yes, there's absolutely no reason why you cannot give feedback to those in charge. This is not working, boss. This is what we need for it to work better for all of us, including you.
I want to do a plug, though, for Balancing Act. I think that Balancing Act has brought about more social change quicker than any other group I have ever seen in my nearly 34 years in the Foreign Service. And I think that there are a whole series of best practices from Balancing Act that we could all co-opt and use. Balancing Act got me on as a senior advisor in the beginning, and not really because I thought it was possible to change. I mean, I had sucked it up and, you know, basically had to disown my babies and everything else that one does as a female political officer to keep moving up. And Balancing Act gave me a whole different, you recruited me as a senior advisor, you took me into a Stu Friedman lecture on four-way wins, where you demonstrated with hard Harvard Business Review data that when we spend more time on ourselves, taking care of ourselves, taking care of our families, and contributing to our communities, that our co-workers say we were on average 7% more effective in the workplace. I mean, it's the kind of data you never forget. You go, wait a minute, I'm actually going to be better at this. So the whole reason why we can't make this change, what's blocking it, is that our mission is too important if we don't give it our all. But what Balancing Act showed us is that with the reframing, you can actually achieve more. You guys did a panel, you got me up there, you got Tom Shannon up there. And now Tom Shannon was the person you needed to influence, not to put it too fine a point on it. And you guys flatter us by saying, who do you want? You know, we need you on our panel. And actually the need to prepare for the panel causes people to reframe it and to think about it. I think if anybody wants to study social change, you should study Balancing Act, because I think you guys have played a complete blinder. So hats off to Balancing Act for making this a better place to work. And we achieve our foreign policy goals better with you. Thank you. Balancing Act. Who else would like to have a question now that I'm done proselytizing?
I think this will be our last one.
Okay.
Sudar Shah again. My question is about moral injury and mitigating it before it gets too bad or healing it. So moral injury came from, it can be traced possibly to the combat literature and people being ordered to do things they don't agree with and carrying out their duty because it's their job, and then having to deal with the internal consequences. And just again, as physicians, in medicine, there's this enormous crisis that many people are being calling burnout, but others are locating it as different constructs. It's not burnout as being physically exhausted only, but it's about the moral strain of having to work in a system that is not in line with one's values, right? So you're all nodding because, I mean, I've been hearing it today, I've been hearing it before. There's so many people that are having to work with poor leadership, being asked to carry out policies, and that's part of the job, and yet we're human, we're not automatons. How can the teams and the leadership provide people a way of making meaning in a setting where meaning is being made a mockery of sometimes?
That's a good question.
So meaning and purpose is one of the 5 factors of individual resilience. Anecdotally, I have no evidence to support this, and I haven't seen research on this, but I have seen this over the last 5 years since I've been doing this. If you lose meaning in your work, in 1 year, your resilience is going to erode to where you are at a low yellow, risk of red. 1 year working in a job where you find no meaning and purpose destroys your resilience. Now, where do you find meaning and purpose in your job? It can be the overarching goal. I would have to say that 3 years ago, when we talked about setting up the center, we spent almost no time on meaning and purpose. I would say that 100% of foreign affairs professionals found meaning and purpose in their jobs. A year later, a whole lot of people were having a crisis in meaning and purpose. They were wondering, wait a minute, I can't defend these foreign policy goals. I am uncomfortable with what I'm being asked to do. And you started to see a crisis in meaning develop across the foreign affairs community. And one of the things we asked people to do was to start looking at, who are you as an individual? What is your identity? Why are you on this earth? How is your identity acting in the workplace? Is what you're doing consistent with your identity that you've chosen for yourself? Are you able to find a place for yourself in this work environment? What would make you leave and what would make you stay? Where are your tripwires? What would you be asked to do that makes you decide to leave? Decide that all ahead of time so that if you're asked to do it, you're not at the time wondering. These are tripwires. What are your tripwires? And why do you stay? What gives you meaning to stay? It could be, I'm staying for my individual team. I'm staying because I want to help the next generation get through this and be better leaders when this all passes and the State Department's valued again, or the USAID development becomes important again, or the commercial work that we do promoting US goods becomes valued again. There's no right answer, but you have to think it through. And then how do you want to be remembered at the end of your life? Because if how you want to be remembered is inconsistent with who you are today and what you're doing, you need to think about what you're doing. And it's okay to change what you're doing. It is okay to say, this isn't for me. I do consultations, I've worked with foreign service professionals who will say, I don't like the foreign service, this isn't me. Great, let's find another place for you. Or I love the foreign service, I have never been happier. Great, stay with it. But you have to address the meaning, because when you are working inconsistent with your values, when you are taking actions that are inconsistent with who you are as a person, that's going to cause injury. It did for me in Iraq. I opposed the invasion of Iraq. I thought we were horrible. I thought what we did was horrific. We were the worst host government I've ever worked with as a consular officer. I witnessed things that I found ethically unacceptable and had to work through that ethical difference in order to be healthy again. I found my meaning in, at least I'm assisting and protecting private Americans. I almost quit though. There was one time when if a decision hadn't gone my way, I would have left. Tripwire. I will not have people's blood on my hands. Write down your tripwires. Be clear about your tripwires and know when it's time to walk away.
Wow. I think that to add to that, building readiness, there's a process of preparation. If you're in the military, there is basic training. As foreign service officers, we go through some elements of training. However, it's questionable how much we are actually prepared and sort of build up readiness to be able to respond to those sorts of environments. And I think that one of the key things is helping to raise awareness when you ask that question of, how do we deal with this the morale issue and the moral compass? We assume because we've all signed up to do the job that we have the same moral compass. The disappointment comes when we realize, as you said, no blood on my hands, that we don't all have the same moral compass, and that more importantly, the organizations or agencies or teams, etc., don't all have the same moral compass. And I think that building awareness that there is an expectation that you would have some element of sort of moral agreement in our work is also really important, because we bring who we are to the table. The other thing I wanted to add in reference to that is the idea that, what is the impact of that experience or that stress on our morality and the things that we've been taught from our families and our experiences and things that we experience, because ultimately we have got to create sort of this environment of collaboration in order to be able to accomplish the goals and things that we have. But if we can't even start in a position where we have the same mutual shared benefits and understanding around our morality and how that impacts the decision making that's taking place, how that impacts the policies that we're trying to implement, then we've already, to me, started at sort of ground zero. And I think we're finding more and more as we're unpacking this element of morality is, to me, another important component is compassion. Compassion is so important. And to be able to look at a situation, I know that I have been in that place where there were decisions expected of me or presented with opportunities or challenges, and I said, not on my watch. That's my response, not on my watch. Meaning that I'm willing to take the risk that were referred to earlier. And it has impacted career. It does impact career. But I have to say, what is my moral compass? What's more important to me? To see people thrive and alive and benefit and to make sure resources are there? Or do I want that next promotion? And no one can answer that but you.
It's called the tension between doing things right to get the next promotion and doing the right thing, right? Which is what provides meaning. Yeah.
Any closing thoughts beyond that, Prue, before I wrap up the panel? Not bad.
Well, I'm thinking about having been the victim of a terrorist attack. I found through my entire spiritual values, moral values, why did they do it? I could not. What was the point? That question was made increasingly difficult when I found that the attack made no difference whatsoever in how our government was approaching Osama bin Laden and terrorism. The fact is, everybody had the information around town to stop bin Laden before 1998. The information was available. It was certainly available after 1998, and the White House sex scandal took precedence over anything. There was never a congressional hearing, never an after action. The only thing there was an accountability review board when people came to Nairobi to blame it on us because, the security gate wasn't properly fastened, something like that. What I found was that we as a community had to, and we talked constantly. It was interesting that nobody left. We all had the opportunity to curtail, and we did it, including the men who lost their moms, and we had orphan kids in school. We stayed, and we talked, and we talked, and we talked. We talked for 10 months. Every time we were together having coffee, reception, we talked, and we helped one another find meaning. 20 years later, when we had a commemoration here, and many of us came back for us, I found that many of us are still suffering from post-traumatic stress. We still have work to do 20 years later, and we're family. I never thought that. Oh my gosh, 20 years later to have Kenyans and Tanzanians and Americans come and say, we are family. And that is how I want to leave it. We are family, and use us as family, and we will defend our country people without guns, and create positive change for our grandchildren.
I want to thank everybody who came today. You are kind of, part of the change that you want to see,
right,
by saying this is actually an important topic and it's worth your time. It was an exceptionally rich discussion. The questions from the audience were just superb. So I want to, I'm inspired. I've got some, like gems to take with me. I am reminded that working without meaning and purpose destroys our resilience faster than getting a good night's sleep and eating our fruits and vegetables can make it better. And so how important that is. I'm also reminded of how many of our fellow Americans, as we put this over a conversation a couple of weeks ago over dinner, don't have work that's meaningful.
Right.
We used to, and many people fill shelves at Walmart and don't find a particular sense of meaning in it. I try to remember that we have been called to some of the most important work at one of the most difficult times that we could be called to it. But Beth also told us in her column to practice gratitude.
Yes.
And I think for lives of purpose and work that's meaningful, we should at least take a moment and do a gratitude check on that every day to try to figure out how do we influence it and keep it moving in the right trajectory. Our challenges are huge, but that part when we do those structured conversations in here, tell us about your career, the good, the bad, and the ugly. When I started this job, the good just would take up this huge amount about the mission and how inspiring it was and working with colleagues like this. And as Beth said, there's been this kind of moral injury thing where people are having a hard time. It's not the first time or the last time that our institutions have faced this. Many of us had a very hard time with the Iraq War. I include myself. So we've been through it and we found the strength and we've carried on. And I think for me, part of what keeps me going on that question of why do you stay in is it is about the next generation, seeing them through safely so that these institutions remain strong and vibrant. But it's a big challenge and it's worth our giving it deep thought like we have today. Thank you all for coming and helping us do that. Would you all join me in a final huge round of applause for this superb panel?